Can we trust the history of Islam? So we've got Dr. J. Smith with us to talk about how Islam historically reliable. We will be talking, or actually not we, Dr. J. Smith will be looking at place called Mecca, which Muhammad born, lived, 570, walked out and then killed people. We will be looking at if this place was historically existed. Of course, after that, we will be questioning if man called Muhammad was existed or not. Before I hand over to you, Jay, why are you even questioning place of birth of Islam?
Well, obviously, if you're going to talk about Islamic origins, you've got to say, which Islam are we talking about? Now, many Muslims will say, well, there is a man named Muhammad who received the Quran in a place called Mecca and Medina, right? Those are the three things they'll claim. My supposition, and what I'm going to do tonight is, there may be a man named Muhammad, just like there's many people named J. Smith. There's probably a lot of people named Hatun. But Hatun from Turkey, who now lives in London, or Jay from United States, who now lives in Pennsylvania, that's the problem. Is it that Muhammad? Because what the Muslims will say, Muhammad lived in Mecca, and he received the Quran in Mecca.
So you are questioning Muhammad, who was born in 570 in Mecca, start having his revelation from 610 in Mecca.
Mm-hmm.
You are questioning if this place was at the first place ever there.
So I start with Mecca. Why? Mecca is the way. Because once I eradicate Mecca, once I disprove Mecca, its existence, then it's obviously whoever that Muhammad is that Islam's talking about, he's not from Mecca. If he's not from Mecca, then he's no longer the man that received the revelation. Because Mecca is absolutely important. Without Mecca, there's no Muhammad, there's no Quran.
Well, I am looking forward to hear what Dr. J. Smith has to share with us. Let's get on with it.
She's skeptical. Now, she is, you can tell by her face, you can tell by her question, the fact she is not convinced.
I am just disappointed. There is an ideology of Islam which has been followed by millions. Now, billions, that the birthplace of this ideology is in question. I am disappointed that history and traditional account of Islam just doesn't match, but I become more confident every time, because when I look at the Bible, I get to see people, places, locations, which has been mentioned in the scripture is being backed up by history.
Absolutely. So with the Bible, we have already crossed this test.
Now we are.
No one questions Jerusalem, right? No one questions that Jesus lived in Jerusalem, died in Jerusalem. No one questions that, or Bethlehem or Nazareth. These are not in question. But without Mecca, everything
Islam is on stake.
There you go. Everything falls to pieces. So let's get right into it, and let's go right ahead. And I need to convince you, and I need to convince all of you. And to do that, I'm going to put up a PowerPoint here, and I'm going to look at it. So I'm going to just take me off it. I don't really want to see me. I just want to see the PowerPoint. I want you to all just watch the PowerPoint, and let's see what we can find. So the problems with Mecca. Mecca is all through the standard Islamic narrative. That's the first thing we need to say. However, here's the problem. If you have if it is the birthplace of Islam, and it's also the birthplace of history, as we're going to see, then it is important. So why is it important? Islam is dependent on three things, and we've said this many times. It's dependent on one book, one man, and one place. The book would be in the Quran, the man being Muhammad, and the place being Mecca. So look at a stool with three legs. There's Quran, there's Muhammad, there's Mecca. With Islam held up by those three legs, if you take away one leg, what begins to happen? Well, it starts to teeter, doesn't it? So if you start taking away Mecca, the other two begin to wobble. If you destroy that leg, then of course the other two collapse, and Islam collapses with it. So that's why we're starting with Mecca. Mecca is a place that still exists today. Muhammad doesn't exist today. The Quran still exists today, but the original manuscripts don't exist. So therefore, we've got to go to the place that still exists today and ask some questions about it. That's why we're starting with Mecca. And by eradicating Mecca, we don't just take out Muhammad or the Quran, we take out the Muhammad of Islam, and we take out the Quran of Muhammad. That's what I'm going to do tonight. So let's go ahead and let's start it. Let's see, and let's begin with what they say. These are the claims they make. Not me, not you, Hatun. They claim that Mecca is the oldest and best known city in history. It's where Adam and Eve were sent down to. In chapter 7, verse 24, they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which is up in space. They were thrown down to earth. Now, we don't know where they were thrown down to earth. You have to go to the traditions. And the traditions say that Eve was thrown down to Mecca. Adam was thrown down to Sri Lanka. He was 90 feet tall. He starts striding up, boom, 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 and goes and meets her there in Mecca. So obviously, this is the first city in the history of mankind. Am I correct? Just say yes. Because no one exists in mankind before Adam and Eve. They're the first man, first woman.
It's not only the first city, but also the first love on the journey.
Okay, so the first love, you like that
journey.
part.
It's because like
Adam
travels all the way without
it's
anything.
The first love story in history, you're right. But it's also the Quran that refers to Abraham. Doesn't say the word Mecca, but it does say that he goes and helps and rebuilds the Kaaba there in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. Abraham lived in 1900 BC, so that's pretty early. All right, we're talking about 4,000 years ago that Abraham was there in Mecca. So it's a very old city as well. Also, if you look at all the traditions, it is the center of trade north, south, east, and west. So someone somewhere should have known about this city because it's the oldest city where Abraham was and where all the trade goes through. At some point, someone should have heard about it historically and certainly when it comes to economically. When you look at the Quran, however, there's a problem. Immediately you see there's a problem in the Quran because when the Quran only has one reference to it in chapter 48, verse 24. If it's the oldest city, the most important city, the city where the Quran was revealed, where Muhammad lived, then you would expect there to be some reference in the Quran to it. Only one verse. Oh, it does talk about the fact that the first sanctuary point of mankind was at Mecca. Is that Mecca? In chapter 3, verse 96, some Muslims think so, but if you know Arabic, that can't be Mecca because it's the wrong consonants. Mecca is the mother of all settlement. It doesn't say Mecca. It just says where the prophet lives is the mother of all settlements in chapter 6 and also chapter 42. Adam and Eve were cast down there, but it doesn't say Mecca again. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't refer to Mecca in chapter 7, verse 24. And Abraham lived there. Again, Mecca is not recorded there. It just says Masjid al-Haram, get the right word, which means the forbidden place of bowing, the Masjid al-Haram. That's all it says in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. Muhammad was born there, according to the traditions. Yes, that's where he lived from 570 up until 622. So for 50 years, he lived there in Mecca. And then, of course, according to chapter 2 of the Quran, 149 and 150, it's where the direction of prayer, the Qibla, was canonized in according to the traditions, in 624. So it's very important, though it doesn't refer to it, even though it's that important. When you look at the traditions now, then you start to see about Mecca. And here's what's curious. The traditions talk quite a bit about Mecca because they're written in the 9th and 10th century. That's 200 to 300 years later. Of course, Mecca was around at the time. But look and see what they say about this place. It's in a valley with a parallel valley. No, there's no valley there in Mecca with a parallel valley. It has streams going. Sir, well, where's this stream in Mecca? There's no stream in Mecca. It's outside the ruins with a pillar of salt where Lot's wife was turned to salt. That we know is way up in the Sea of Galilee. That has nothing to do with Mecca. That's 600 miles to 1,000 miles further north. According to the tradition, it has fields, trees, grass, fruit, clay, loam, olive trees. Now, what does that tell you, Hatu? And it tells me that there's a lot of vegetation there with a lot of water. A lot of vegetation needs water. And that there are mountains overlooking the Kaaba. None of these things make any sense with Mecca. When you look at the topography of Mecca, it doesn't fit. When you look at the desertification of Mecca, it doesn't fit. So it's because it's just too arid and to support any of those above. When we look at the geographical locations in the Quran itself, and because the Quran does talk about 65 geographical references, 9 places are mentioned because it refers to some places over and over and over again. And what's fascinating is what it repeats over and over again. 23 times it refers to these people living in Ad. They are the biblical Uz. 24 times it refers to these people from Thamud. They are the Nabateans. And then 7 times it refers to these people from Midian. And it refers over and over again that this prophet, whoever his name is, it doesn't name him. Muhammad's name is only found 4 times in the Quran, and not for any of these instances. What it does say is this prophet has all these relationships with these people from Ad, Thamud, and Midian. Look at all the many times. Look at the map on the right. Do you see where they are? Look where Ad, where Thamud, Midian. They're way up in what is today Jordan. That's 600 miles too far north. So whoever wrote the Quran, when he's talking about this prophet, he was having daily contact with these people. They're 600 miles away. That means going up and down 1,200 miles. You can't do that in one day, Hatud, unless you have a helicopter or if you have a jet, an airplane. They didn't exist in the 7th century AD. What's more, look at all the prophets that are named in the traditions. Adam and Eve, who were buried in Mecca. So was Seth buried in Mecca. So was Ishmael, Noah, Hud, who is the great-grandson of Noah, Salah, the grandfather of Hagar, Queen of Sheba, Daniel. Up to 300 prophets, according to traditions, were buried in Mecca. And what's more, when they all died, they were buried in a kneeling position because they continued to pray, which means that they were going to be preserved, which suggests to me that they would still be there today if they're all to be preserved all that time. Take a look what's happening in Mecca. You have all these buildings being built, all these cranes everywhere. When you build tall buildings, like you can see that clock tower there. See that clock tower? That is the 4th highest building in the world right now. It is huge. Now, when you build, and there are about 8, 9 different buildings that are around it, all of which are skyscrapers. In order to build skyscrapers that high, you need to have deep foundations. When you dig deep foundations, what do you find? You find those prophets, right? If you're going to build buildings, you need to find prophets. Why is it they can't find one prophet? If up to 300 are buried all around the Kaaba, they should have come up with a myriad of prophets. Not one have they found. If the above were true, this would mean that almost all of the biblical material would have to be rewritten and all the stories be redirected 600 to 1,000 miles further south. Yet there is so much evidence for the biblical narrative historically, yet almost nothing for Islam's. Can you see a problem with that right there? Then we get to the reference to the place itself. Dr. Patricia Corona spent, I don't know how many years, but she's the only woman that could read the languages of all these documents from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way up into the 7th century. She could read and write 15 languages. She scoured all of these documents and found that the first reference she could find to Mecca was the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuato Byzantia Arabica, written in 741 AD. That's 100 years after Muhammad died. That's the first reference. If it was such an important city, why had nobody heard about this until the 8th century, mid-8th century? The earliest map that you could find with Mecca on it is not till 900 AD. That's a problem. Well, let's talk about maps. Let's go and continue there. When you look at the maps, you need to go back to Ptolemy. Ptolemy is the one who is credited with describing the peninsula of Arabia. And he writes in the 2nd century, but he never draws a map. He just puts all the locations and he puts them into near where the rivers are or near where the mountains are. All these are on his geography of Arabia. Now, in 1482, this man named Leinhard Holig took what Ptolemy had written and he drew this map that I'm showing you right there. Notice where the question mark is? That's where Mecca is. There is no Mecca on this map. Ptolemy didn't know about any place called Mecca. Here's another map. This was drawn in 1541 by Laurent Fries. Notice Mecca's missing in that map as well. And yet this is all from Ptolemy in the 2nd century. 2nd century, we're talking about 500 years before Muhammad even was born. Then you have Sebastian Münster out of Germany, who put together this map following what Ptolemy wrote in his geography. Again, Mecca is missing. Here is a redacted map from the modern century going back to what Ptolemy says. Notice Mecca is missing there. Here's another redacted map from the modern day looking back to see what the Ptolemy said, and you cannot find Mecca. Not all, at all. When you look at the Qiblas, now this is Dan Gibson's work, all the Qiblas, he spent 25 years looking at all the Qiblas. These are the mosques that were surrounding the Middle East. He went to Guangzhou in China. That's still in question. He went to India and Shadman. He went to Syria. He went to Egypt. He went to Israel, Jordan, Yemen. All of these places, he went to a mosque, and guess what he found? All the Qiblas were not facing Mecca, though they should have been. Up until 706, not one Qibla was facing Mecca. They were all facing Petra, which is in Jordan, 600 miles further north. Go ahead.
It might be helpful to remind the audience that Qibla is the direction of the prayer which Muslim needs to face when they do their prayer.
And every mosque that's built always has a Qibla wall. So they build them with that intention. And you can see a Qibla wall because it's the longest wall. And that's why it was easy for Dan Gibson to find where the Qibla walls were. You can do that even today. They still exist. Here's the problem. None of the Qibla walls were facing Mecca. They were all facing Petra up until 706. So when was the first mosque that was facing Mecca? The earliest mosque that he could find was 715. Some say 729. Anyway, 8th century. We're talking about 8th century. This is a good 100 years after Muhammad had died, if he had been living. Let's talk about the trade route, because this is when when I was studying Islam and when I had to do my master's degree, I had to study Montgomery Watt. You have to hear about it. Because Montgomery came to the aid of the Muslims. They had to find Mecca. So he, back in the last century, he put this theory together called the trade route theory. I don't know if you've heard it before. I've heard it. We've always studied it. And this is the trade route theory. Back in the 7th century, or 6th and 7th century, all of the trade came from China and India. They couldn't go north because of the Hindu Kush and the Himalaya Mountains. So they came to the western coast of India, across the Arabian Sea, followed the arrow, went up through the Straits of Hormuz, up through the Persian Gulf to what is today Basra, and from Basra, boom, 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 right across Iraq. What is today Iraq? What is today Syria? And what is today Lebanon? That is where all the trade went. There was a problem in the 5th century. In the 5th century, two great empires, the Persian Empire right there, known as the Sassanians, and the Christian Empire, known as the Byzantines. So one was Zoroastrian, the other was Christian. They started warring with each other. And because of that, that shut down that trade. It could no longer go through the Persian Gulf. It could no longer go through what is today Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. It had to be redirected. So Montgomery Watt said this, aha, I'll give you a solution. This is what happened. Instead of going up through the Persian Gulf, they redirected the trade down this way. And they came across the Arabian Sea down to Aden, and they went zip 1,250 miles up to Gaza, going right through Mecca. So Mecca then controlled the trade. That's why Mecca was important. That proves that Mecca existed. That's what he said in the last century. Dr. Patricia Corona looked at this and she saw two problems. Maybe you can see the same two problems. Here's the first one. She says, hold on a minute. If you're coming across the Arabian Sea, no one doubts that. You're coming this way, you go to Gaza, but from Aden, you get off at Aden, you get all your goods off at Aden, but take a look what happens next. You go up to Taif, which is on the Western Plateau, but from Taif, Mecca is down off it. You have to go down to Mecca. Do you see the detour there? And then you've got to come back up to Yathrib there, and then go on up to Tabuk, Khaybar, and then, of course, to Gaza up in the north. Do you see the detour? That's the first problem. Why would they be coming off the plateau, going down to Mecca, which is 3,000 feet down, with no water? With no water, there's no vegetation, no people. And then you have to come all the way back up to Yathrib with no water to water your camels, and there's nothing there in Mecca for them to go down to. So that's the first problem. But here's the biggest problem. And my 10-year-old son saw this right away. Right, so let's go back, throw that away, and let's start again. You're coming across Arabia, and you're coming across the Arabian Sea. You go to Aden. Why would you go on land to begin with when you have a waterway? Look to the left. There's a waterway. You see it there? The Red Sea. Why don't you just go up the Red Sea? You're already on ship. Remember, if you take a ton of goods by land, you can go 50 miles by land, the same amount as 1,250 miles by sea. Why? Because by land, you have to protect the animals, you have to feed the animals, you have to water the animals, and you have to protect your goods. Anybody could be behind a boulder or a rock or a hill or a sand dune, and they could attack you. But if you go by sea, there are no sand dunes, there's no rocks, there's no camels, there's no feeding. You don't have to feed anybody, you don't have to water anything. You just put your sail up, and the wind blows you. It is perfectly free. That's why even today, if you want to go take goods across large areas of land, you don't go by land, you go by sea. Even today we do that. It's the cheapest way. So she went back, knowing 15 languages. She went to the trading documents from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up to the 7th century, and this is what she found. She looked at the evidence from those centuries, and she found that all of it went this way. It came across the Arabian Sea. Yes, it did stop in Aden because they wanted to get provisions there, and you probably take off some provisions, but they didn't take off the goods there. No. They went to Agilis. There's Agilis, which is in Eritrea today. And from Agilis, they went right up the Red Sea, up to Petra, from there to Gaza, and then from Gaza, right across the Mediterranean Sea. That is what all the trading documents say. So Montgomery Watt had it completely wrong because he didn't look at the trading documents, and he didn't look at a map. But Patricia Crone looked at a map, then looked at the trading documents, and shut down, debunked Montgomery Watt's theory. She did this in 1987 with Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. With her book, she got a death threat for writing that book. She had to move from Oxford to Cambridge University. Now, but here's something. She didn't go far enough. We've learned something new since Patricia Crone has died. She's no longer living. We've learned something more concerning the Red Sea route. Here's what she didn't know. And here's the big question. If you're going up the Red Sea, where do you go up the Red Sea? Why is it they went to Ajalus? And we've asked Muslims that. They don't know. They say, well, they probably didn't go up the Red Sea. If they get to the Red Sea, they went to Jeddah, and from Jeddah, they went to Mecca. Therefore, Jeddah was the one that supplied Mecca. Therefore, they did control the trade. No. Look at this map. And you notice, I don't know if you see a dark blue line there. Do you see a dark blue line?
Yeah.
That's a deep channel. Let me just put it in red here. There's a deep channel that goes up. That's where large ships go. Today, that's where they go. But back in the 7th century, they didn't have large ships. They had much smaller ships that used sailboats. And what they did is they went up the left side of the Red Sea. They went this direction. So they went up across. You can see those are the yellow channels that are even today or today. Why did they go up the yellow channel? Well, for one very good reason. Unlike the East Arabian shore, which is arid, that's the right shore, with no fresh water and thus few people, the West African shore that you see here had plenty of fresh water and had larger populations. What's more, the West Coast had easily accessible ports, and we know their names. Those, you can go and you can Wikipedia this. You don't even have to trust me. Go up and see what their names are. Let me just give them to you. There are 5 coastal cities along the West Coast. The first one is Asab. Look at the date that we have history. We can trace it back all the way back to 246 BC. That's long before Islam. That's in what today is in Eritrea, which is just north of Ethiopia. You have Ajalus, 79 AD. That predates Islam. You have Sawakin, which is in the Sudan. That's 170 AD. Did you notice that also predates Islam? Then you have 2 in Egypt, Berenice and Safaga. Notice the dates, 275 BC, 282 BC. These are ancient ports. They're all along the West Coast. What's most interesting is their dates all predates Islam. All 5 days are exactly 1 day's boat ride apart. Because if you're going by boat, you need a place to shelter every night. So you can see they're equally 5 days. All of the trade went up the West Coast. Now, on the Red Sea, the Muslims say yes, but what about the Arabian side? The only place we know of is a place called Yanbu. Yanbu is historical. Why? Because it provided provisions for Yathrib. So we do have reference to Yanbu prior to the 8th century. What about Jeddah? Because that's what Muslims claim is the city that supplied all the trade to Mecca, or the produce. Well, Dr. Gerald Hotting, who is my professor at School of Oriental and African Studies back in the 1990s. I studied under him. He has written the book on Jeddah. And what he says is Jeddah did not exist until the 8th century. And the reason Jeddah was created was because Mecca needed a port for provisions for itself. So Jeddah comes after Mecca, not before Mecca. And Mecca, we don't have any reference till 741, till the 8th century. So both Jeddah and Mecca are 8th century cities. Therefore, they have no history for either Jeddah or Mecca prior to the 8th century. Why? Because neither had water nor a population large enough to accommodate yearly trade. Therefore, let's just get rid of Jeddah and Mecca. Now off they go flying off, which then asks the question, without Mecca, what then happens to 7th century Islam? Can you see, if you eradicate it from the historical record, if there is no Mecca, what do you do with Islam? Getting back to what we started out this talk with. But I want to underline what I'm just saying. Take a look at this topographical map. I want to show you the trade route. This is the trade route we do know. This is the trade route we do have reference for. Look and see where the trade route starts. Starts in Aden, then goes up to Sana'a, then goes up to Najran, up to Taif, up to Yathrib, up to Tabuk, up to Petra, and up to Gaza. Notice it's following the Western Plateau. Can you see that? It's very visual there when you look at topographical map. So where's Mecca on that? There's Mecca. It's off the Western Plateau by 3,000 feet, proving that it could not be. To just underline my point, let me show you this one. Here's another topographical map using line drawings. There's Aden, there's Sana'a, then we go to Najran, up to Taif, on up to Yathrib. There you have Tabuk, Petra, and Gaza. So where's Mecca? Bingo. Now, can you see? Clearly, it's way off the plateau. No way in the world could they go that far down, then come all the way back up if there was a trade route in. Once again, it is clear that Mecca is way too far down, 3,000 feet off the plateau. Let's then talk about the civilizations, because if Mecca was known, someone somewhere around that area should have heard about it, right? So let's ask the people who were in that area. And this is what Dr. Patricia Corona did. She could read their languages. So therefore, she went and she asked this question. Were there any civilizations, any peoples who knew about this place? Any civilization? Someone somewhere should have. So let's look at the empires that existed. She went to the Syrians. She went to Shalmaneser III and Sargon II, Sennacherib. Look at all their writings. No reference to Mecca. She went to the Babylonians, to Nabonidus. No reference to Mecca. She went to the Roman Empire, looking at Manius, Marcellinus, and also Caesar's writings. She went to Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Ptolemy. No reference to Mecca. She then went to the Persian Empire, to the city that was headquartered there in Hira. No reference to Mecca. So those are farther away and they're much earlier. What about those empires that were closer to Mecca? Let's ask that question. So let's look at the closer ones. Well, she went to the Nabateans, just north of Mecca. No reference in any of their writings. Saba, no reference. The Himyarites, no reference. The Azdis, no reference. To the Kindas, which is where Riyadh is today. That is Du Kahilum, well-known city, but no reference to Mecca, even from that civilization. She went to the Kedonites, the Taima, Duma, and Dedan. Nope, couldn't find any reference to Mecca. And then she went to the Nubians, the Axumites, and the Abyssinians. No reference whatsoever. None of these kingdoms, none of these empires had ever heard of Mecca, either far away or nearby. Can you notice? Look at all those red circles and squares. They surround Mecca, yet not one of them have heard of the city. That's curious. What's more than that, let's now look at the cities that were unknown, like the other cities that are just incidental in the same area as Mecca. Let's see if they were known, because it could be maybe nobody knew about any of these cities, right? No. Take a look at what we now find. If you look at the historical record, you will see that Najran, which is just 400 miles south, Strabo refers to it, Pliny the Elder refers to it, Ptolemy refers to it, Aratus refers to it. What about Sana and Taif and Yathrib, Khaybar? Take a look at them. All of those cities, Patricia Crone found, have documentation that goes back to the 6th century. All of them that we have that predate Islam. What about Mamre in Clinic? Clinic talks about the fact that this is a well-known city during the Roman Empire. Petra, Zukowski says this is one of the oldest cities in that area from the Nabatean Empire. Maghrib, Muhammad Markaten in 2002 came out of a book showing the whole history of that city. Look at all these other incidental cities that were nothing as important as Mecca. How come they were all known, but nobody had heard of Mecca? Do you see a problem there? So all of these insignificant towns are referred to, but not Mecca. Now, let's look at it. And you can see why I looked at the topographical map, but I want to look at these topographical maps, and you'll see why real quickly. Now, this is what we did on the ladder in 2019 when I came to London. You remember these four? We held them up for the whole crowd to see. And I said, what do you notice about Mecca, Medina? Just look at these topographical maps and notice very clearly that they're all in a desert. Mecca and Medina are in a desert. In a desert, that's significant. Where there's a desert, there's no water. Where there's no water, there's no food. Where there's no food, there's no people. Where there's no people, there's no towns. Where there's no towns, there's no cities. Where there's no cities, there's no civilization. Where there's no civilization, there is no history. Just like Mars, without water, there is no point in ever going. And that's why we have nothing about Mecca, because there's no way that anybody could have lived there. That's why we have no reference to it. There's no civilization. Well, let's talk about the Hajj. Let's go to Mecca itself and let's look at the Hajj, which are the 5 stages. And let's ask the first thing. When you look at the stages of the Hajj, the first thing you do is you go to that square building called the Kaaba, which is interesting because it means cube in Hebrew. Interestingly, cube also is the same word in Arabic. Interestingly, it's the same word in Hebrew. Both in Hebrew and Arabic, cube is Kaaba. So Kaaba is a well-known name in Judaism. Why? Because that same cube was in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies. The Kaaba, the original Kaaba, was in Jerusalem. Notice when all the Muslims get there, they circumambulate 7 times counterclockwise. Why don't they go clockwise? Everybody goes clockwise everywhere else around the world except for Mecca. They go counterclockwise. The reason is because that's what the Jews did. The Jews went around in Mount Moriah, the Holy of Holies, 7 times. Why 7 times? Because that's what God demanded in Jericho, that they go counterclockwise 7 times around Jericho. And the Jews continue that today. It looks like that the whole problem with the whole idea of Kaaba and circumambulation 7 times comes straight out of Judaism, comes right out of Jerusalem. But after they go, after you see that, you need to ask, well, the original Kaaba that Dan Gibson thought it was in Petra. I would suggest the original Kaaba is Jerusalem itself. Now today there's the Dome of the Rocks. We don't have the original temple, nor do we have the original Holy of Holies. But you notice where that big open area, that's where the circumambulation existed. That Abdul Malik did not get rid of, proving that this was well known because we have Josephus talking about the circumambulation, talks about Jerusalem, and mentions the Kaaba. After they do the circumambulation, what do Muslims do next? Well, they go back and forth from Safa to Marwa, run back and forth 7 times. Why? Well, if you ask any Muslim, they'll say because that's Hagar looking for water. The reason why, she's run out of water and she's looking for her son Ishmael, and then she stops, she finds water bubbling out of the desert, and that's the Zamzam well. Now, here's the thing, Hatu. You know that the story of Hagar is very clear in Islam, that Hagar was thrown out by Abraham, right? She was thrown out. But where did Abraham live when he threw her out? Did he not live in Mecca? Did he not rebuild the Kaaba with Ishmael? So therefore, Abraham was living in Mecca, right? And he throws her out into the desert. She can't find water. Well, hold on a minute. How far is Safa and Marwa from the Kaaba? Just 100 yards. How far is the Zamzam well? 50 yards. If she's way out in the desert, she can't find water, then what's she only doing 100 yards away from the Kaaba? Which is surrounded by city, surrounded by people living there, including Abraham himself. She could just go onto any door and ask for water, right? So obviously, this Safa and Marwa are not the original Safa and Marwa. This is nothing more than what we call a facsimile. It is a symbolism of the original Safa and Marwa. So where is the original Safa and Marwa? Not in Mecca, obviously. You need to look elsewhere. Of course, Dan Gibson thought it was in Petra, but I would suggest, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Take a look at, when you look at Safa and Marwa, you notice they're just rocks. They're about 20 feet high. Obviously, these are not mountains. Children can climb on them if they're only 20 feet high, proving that this is nothing more than a symbol of the original Safa and Marwa. They're way too small to be mountains. They're nothing more than the same thing. If you go to Las Vegas, you'll see an Eiffel Tower there, a very small one, and you'll also see a Sphinx, a very small one, and you also see a pyramid, a very small one, because those are not the original Eiffel Tower or the Sphinx or the pyramids. Those are all in other countries, Egypt and also in France. The same thing is going on here. How do we know that? Well, Gibson thought the same thing exists in Petra, but I would suggest even before Petra, you need to go to Jerusalem. Because in Jerusalem, you have the exact same thing. 2 mountains. One is Mount Moriah. That's where the temple stood. On the other side of the Kidron Valley is Mount Scopus. And all the Jewish pilgrims, when they ever came to the Holy of Holies, the Kaaba there in Jerusalem, they would go to Mount Moriah, then they go down to the Kidron Valley and go back up to Mount Scopus. Now, Josephus refers to Mount Moriah, and he also refers to Mount Scopus. Notice what he calls them in Arabic. He gives their name in Arabic. Mount Moriah is Marwa. Mount Scopus is Safa. The very 2 names that Muslims use today are the original names that were in Jerusalem. The Arabic names that were in Jerusalem, proving that this also was borrowed from the Jews, borrowed from Jerusalem. So we have the Kaaba there, and you can see that it probably more than likely the Kaaba was first borrowed from Jerusalem. You have Safa and Marwa, that's probably borrowed from Jerusalem. The hill of Arafat, that is where the hill is, the Arafat is, looks like that is also borrowed, because we don't know the Jerusalem antecedent to that yet. We do know that there's also Hill Arafat in Petra, but where the Petran one got it from. And then you have the Jamarats. This is the stones that you throw 49 or 72 stones at one devil, which is interesting because up until 1980, there was always one devil, notice. And then 1980, there was such huge crowds that they had to build 3 Jamarats. Now, what they're saying when you go back prior to 1980, the tradition was, this is Abraham stoning the devil for seducing him. When you then come to today, if you go to Mecca and see these 3 Jamarats, what are they now saying today? These are 3 different seductions of Abraham, or attempts by the devil to seduce Abraham. 3 instead of 1. So even in the last 40 years, the tradition has changed. If it's changing in our lifetime, then why are we surprised that this hasn't happened all the way through the last 1400 years, especially the very first 100 years? If you go to the Zamzam well, that is found in Petra, but also it's the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. So there's the antecedent to that as well. The only thing you can't find an antecedent for is the black stone, the black rock, which is right there on the eastern corner of the Kaaba. What in the world is that doing there? It's the height of idolatry, because it's, again, you kiss it every time you circumambulate, you kiss it, so you get your sins forgiven. Who can forgive sin but God himself? And why are they letting a stone take on and usurp the tradition that God has for him? I want to talk of the black stone anymore pretty quick, because when you look at the history of the black stone, what we do know, if you look at the history, it can be traced all the way back to the Phoenicians. They were the ones that had the first black stone, and it was a meteorite that came out of the heavens. So they thought it was a gift of God. The Romans then got that stone and they brought it into their territories. It was Aurelius Antoninus Elagabalus, who in the 3rd century AD took that stone and brought it to Damascus. And he started the tradition. Remember, traditions come and go, and they keep on being re-aligned, like we just saw with the Jamarat. He started the tradition that wherever the black stone is, there is God's presence. So that was started in the 3rd century. It was then moved to Petra in the 7th century. In 687, Ibn Zubair he confronted Abd al-Malik, and he rebelled against Abd al-Malik, who was the caliph at that time. He destroyed the Kaaba, destroyed much of Petra, grabbed the black stone and sent it with his families, the women and children, down to the south. He remained there in Petra. Al-Hajjaj then came to war against him under the authority of Abd al-Malik, and he was killed at Petra. Zubair was. But meanwhile, he takes the stone is there in the south. We're not told where it was sent to. Obviously, it was sent to what is today Petra, probably his birthplace. That's probably why he was sent there, because then you start seeing a lot of pilgrims following the stone. Why? Because that's where God's presence is. So once the God's presence leaves Petra, it goes down to Mecca. Who then needs help then? Those who come from Zubair needs allies. And so he looks to the Abbasids, who are up in Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon is what is Baghdad today. They were the Persians who hated the Arabs, because it was the Arabs that took over what they previously owned. They controlled the Arabs until Heraclius destroyed the Arabs in 622. So Abbasids see their chance. They now have the black stone. They are the ones who are against the Arabs, the Umayyads at that time. They then ally themselves with Zubair and his descendants. They now have the pilgrims place because they now have the sanctuary. That's why they started the worship of the sanctuary there in Mecca. We can prove that by looking at an inscription, which I'm going to talk about. Once they started doing that, they then start pushing their weight against the Umayyads, and you know what happens next. Back and forth, back and forth. You can see why the Qiblets start to change, because those are trying to hedge the bets to see who's going to follow the Umayyads, who's going to go with the Abbasids. The Abbasids finally went out in 749. By 749, then Mecca becomes established as the main sanctuary. They then eradicate the Umayyads and destroy all their mosques, destroy their Qibla, and from that time on, from the mid-8th century, that's where you then have all the Qiblas facing the Meccan sanctuary. So we've looked at 6 conclusions concerning the historical problems of Mecca. We looked and found that it has not, geographically speaking, Mecca, it can be thrown out. We looked at the maps and found that there's no reference to it on any of the maps. We looked at the Qiblas and found that almost all the Qiblas can be are facing the wrong way. They're not facing Mecca until 715, or some say 726. We looked and debunked the trade route theory put out by Montgomery Watt. We also debunked the sea-based trade through Mecca, and then we debunked the 5 stages of the Hajj. Now, though Mecca has existed according to Islam since Adam and Eve, according to chapter 7, verse 24, there is no evidence of it anywhere until 741. And everything we now find in Mecca, we could previously find in Petra, and now even earlier in Jerusalem. So let's conclude what we've just gone through. Mecca is foundational for both Muhammad and the Quran. So without it, they both fall. You need Mecca, unless if you don't have Mecca, you don't have Muhammad, and you don't have the Quran. References to Mecca in the Quran and traditions do not hold up historically. It is not the center of history. Geographically, you've got a problem with Ad, Thamud, and Midian. Linguistically, we didn't even get into this, but look at the Quran itself, and you can see that the Arabic is Nabatean Aramaic. Why? Because of the tar marbuta, the alif maksura, and the definite article. Those three endings and the definite article that's at the beginning of every word do not exist in Nabatean Aramaic, but they do exist in the Quran. Sorry, they do not exist in the,
Arabic.
they do not exist in Sabaic Arabic, which is what they would have spoken in Mecca and Medina. They use Sabaic Arabic, which does not have the tar marbuta, does not have the alif maksura, does not have the definite article. Who has those three? Nabatean Aramaic has those three. Obviously, and whoever wrote the Quran had to come up from the Nabatean area, which is today Jordan, much further north, 600 miles further north. Neither the prophets supposedly buried there, nor the ancient maps, Ptolemy's especially, nor the Qiblas, Gibson's research support on early Mecca. Neither the land trade route on the Western Plateau, nor the Red Sea trade routes in the African coast support an early Mecca. Topographical maps prove Mecca is off the Western Plateau and in a desert with no water, thus the reason no civilization surrounding Arabia has heard of Mecca, as people need water. The 5 stages of the Hajj, the Kaaba, Safa, Marwa, Arafat, the Jamarat, the Zamzam well, and also the Black Stone support Jerusalem and not Mecca. Someone, somewhere, at some time, should have known about this city, yet no one, anywhere, nor at any time has, proving that it never existed at the time of Muhammad, nor during early Islam. Okay, we're going to stop there. Back to you.
So I find it's interesting that while Mecca is identified as the birthplace of Islam, while Saudi Arabia is making billions of pounds or dollars from people, from Muslims who go there to do Hajj and then kiss that black stone.
To say nothing of the Zamzam water that they sell all over the world.
Yeah, and it's like you can even buy the bottles in London, people bring it. Now, it's been a couple of years. We are still questioning, is this Mecca was ever existed?
And this is why it's so important that people start looking at the historical record. The historical record is very clear that it doesn't. Now, here's the problem for the Muslims. And if there are Muslims watching, if the Muslims are going to claim that Mecca did exist, they've got to first do one thing. And they've got to persuade you and me.
We need Muslims to show us evidence.
There you go.
From minimum from 570 AD. That's the birth of Muhammad.
Minimum, yes. Yeah. I would say even from the 7th century. I would say even this next century. Show us anything from the 7th century for Mecca.
I'll go with 570. I'll go with 570.
Okay, all right.
Let's wait and then see what they're going to produce. I remember we've been asking this question for years now, still no answer.
No answer. And Patricia Crone started, and she wrote her first book called Hagerism way back in, that was 1977. Now, she said very clearly that the word Hagerism was the wrong word. She should have used Hagerism. But all the footnotes that she have, all the evidence in that book, she always held till she died. And to this day, no one can confront her. When she wrote Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, which questions the very thing we're questioning in 1987, 10 years later, and asked this question, where is this Mecca? Why is it none of the mosques are facing towards Mecca? She didn't know about Dan Gibson at that time, nor did he know who she was. She saw this from just going to the mosque herself. But she really said there's no reference at all in any of these documentations. Now, if she did that in 1987, we're now in 2023. Why is it Muslims haven't been able to just shut her down with one piece of evidence? One piece of evidence is all we're asking for.
Well, according to Muslims, God of Islam makes miracle. I am sure they will produce something.
We're still waiting.
We are still waiting. While we are waiting, of course, we are acknowledging Saudi Arabia is still making money from them with the place which was never existed, apparently. Dr. J. Smith, thank you very much.
Before we go, just one last conclusion. If Mecca did not exist, then pretty much we've shut down Muhammad and we shut down the Quran. Because if we're going to talk about Muhammad, which are going to do next, if we're going to talk about Muhammad, which Muhammad are we talking about? See, Muslims have to have Muhammad in Mecca, because if he's not in Mecca, he's no longer their Muhammad. It's another Muhammad. So we're going to talk about that next.
We will figure that out. Dr. J. Smith, thank you very much for helping us to unpack if Mecca was existed or not. We do hope that Muslims kind of take it seriously and then come back with some answers, because we've been asking same questions for a couple of years now and they play the silent game. Hopefully they will come up with something. Thank you very much for being available and taking your time to talk to us. By God's grace, we will see you again. Until we see you, may Christ crucified silently with his love.